So thank you, everybody. I'm excited to be here. As was pointed out, I am local to New England, so this area and being able to partner with NDIA New England and help them bring this conference together was exciting for me. Today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about SBOMs and software bill of materials and the importance of that. When we look at the Department of Defense and we look at everything from those travel systems that reimburse travel to transportation systems, all the way over here to the state-of-the-art classified technology platforms that our warfighters use, they all have one thing in common, and that at some point in that supply chain, software plays a pivotal role. Even people who will say, oh yeah, but this doesn't have any connectivity to it whatsoever. Well, was it designed with a CAD system? Were there documentations produced that were exchanged that used software? And so I would hypothesize that pretty much everything we do today as a society in some way, shape, or form is touched by software. And it's not just the iPhones in our pockets, and it's not just the connected IoT platforms that we see out there that's affecting the way that we view and the way that we work with information today. And so at the Department of Defense, we talk a lot about, if we can get the slides up, please. We talk a lot about acceleration. You hear a lot of our senior leaders talk about the need to accelerate innovation. And when we think about the acceleration of innovation, we look at all the strategies that we put out there. We have a brand new software modernization strategy that was signed out by the Deputy Secretary of Defense. We've had a digital modernization initiative that's been around for a while. When we look at all of those things and we step back and look, what we really need and what we're really talking about is a holistic acceleration strategy. And no such thing actually exists. It's just conceptual, but we really want to accelerate. We want to accelerate the way we use data. We want to accelerate the way we secure that data and we secure our networks. We want to accelerate our access to the cloud with some of our cloud activities, whether it's at an infrastructure, a platform, or software as a service. We want to accelerate, as we heard this morning from Dr. Herman, our network activities, our infrastructure, whether it's software-defined networks, whether it's software-defined WANs, et cetera, et cetera. And we also want to accelerate the way we automate and work with these things when we think about DevSecOps and the software factory, something near and dear to my heart as the DoD's Chief Software Officer. And we want to be able to accelerate the data that is produced from those software factories. And when we think about our cybersecurity journey, those software factories are fundamentally part of the equation, and they're often overlooked. We often talk about cybersecurity, we talk about data, we talk about AI and ML in the department. Well, where does digital data come from? It's not a hard question. It comes from software, right? And if our processes say that it's going to take us a year to apply a patch to a software system that we know has a cybersecurity vulnerability because we're stuck in our ways, does anybody else see a problem with that? Like, that's where these software factories become so critical. If you need a new field for your analytics algorithm that you're looking at driving into a particular software package, we need the ability to tie that between our development environments and our production environments. Hence that idea of a continuous integration and continuous deployment into an operationally relevant environment, right? And so software is quite critical, and if we look at this idea, we're starting to move towards this realm where software-defined applies to everything. We've had software-defined radios, software-defined networks, but we're seeing the word software-defined show up more and more and more in our daily conversations. And it's critical to our cybersecurity in particular as well, right? So I think this is an area worth sort of diving into a little bit further. What is the difference between software controlled, what we've historically had, because software's been around. Software's been around as long as hardware, right? When we had hardware, we still needed firmware, we needed embedded systems. But software controlled is unforgiving. It's I'm going to type a long command at a prompt somewhere and hope that I got all the flags right, and I'm going to hit enter and go, oh crap, I had an extra space. We've all been there, right? Oh crap. And there's no going back from that. At that point, that command is off and executing, and it's unforgiving. In that software-controlled environment, the best you're going to have is somebody looking over your shoulder going, hey, you got the space bar, right? And it's too late at that point. With the software-defined world, we pivot substantially, and we create a better ecosystem where we actually create automation and we program what we're trying to accomplish. We bring in libraries, supply chain, right? We bring in libraries and frameworks to help us out. We use the software factories in that CI/CD pipeline to actually do things like peer reviews. Before I merge this into the primary branch or the master branch and actually execute that in a productionally relevant environment, I'm going to have multiple eyes look at that and go, well, wait a minute, what are we thinking here? What are we doing here? Have we vetted this library? And so that pivot to being agile and responsive and to actually understanding that we can centralize this source code and live in this software-defined world is quite powerful. It's empowering in the sense that we don't have to be perfect the first time. And as humans, rarely are we perfect the first time. I think we can all agree on that, right? So this idea of pivoting from software-controlled to software-defined is quite fundamental. But yet, despite all that we have done within the DoD, we have ATOs, authorizations to operate. There's been guidance on continuous ATOs that have come out. We have audits. We audit these systems. We bring in third parties. We have governance bodies, like the DMI XCOM is a governance body that I'm involved with. Another governance body is the Software Modernization Senior Steering Group. We have governance over these systems, and yet we're still all here talking today about the criticality of cybersecurity and how we need to improve. We lack what I would call visual clarity into the whole ecosystem. And that's why this software-defined concept is so critical, in my opinion, because it brings us the visual clarity that we need, the multiple sets of reviews, but at the speed of relevance. I don't have to wait for paperwork to be passed around or emailed. I can do this in a fully auditable system that is available and accessible to everybody that needs to be there at the right level of privileges. And I can go through that process and gain more clarity that I've lacked with historical endeavors. And that's why the DevSecOps concept is so critical in the DoD, whether we're talking about the deployment of software-defined capabilities in our infrastructure, software-defined capabilities like we heard with infrastructure as code in our cloud ecosystem, or software-defined capabilities in our AI and ML activities and what we're trying to accomplish there. And so all of this really starts to come to a head when we start to look at this presidential executive order, right? Last year, when President Biden signed out the cyber executive order, it really elevated something that's existed for a long time. We've always had bill of materials. There's been manufacturing bill of materials, and usually in the old world, we didn't put a letter of the alphabet in front of it. We just called it a bomb. But now we've started to differentiate a little bit. We have SBOMs, and this has become a phrase in the lexicon for those of us in the DIB and beyond. And when we look at this idea of the software bill of materials, it really starts to help you realize how vast this supply chain is that you may not have had insight into before. You start realizing that the transient dependencies on the software that you've been taking for granted actually fill a 3-ring binder. And do you know where all of the committers, where are they resident? What are they doing with those commits in that source code, in that library that you're dependent on? There are nation states like Russia and China where their citizens are compelled to share information with their militaries, with their governments, with their different agencies that we really don't necessarily trust as a society over here in the United States. And so understanding that value of SBOM, it's not the generation of an SBOM and saying, here you go, here's an SBOM. Or what I actually shudder in fear over is somebody printing out an SBOM, shoving it into a manila envelope and mailing it, or using an optical CD and mailing it and going, here you go. I've met my contractual obligations. I've provided you a printout of that SBOM, we want to be able to consume that information. You need to consume that information from your suppliers, and we want to consume it on our end. And we need to think holistically about what does that mean? Because when we think about the consumption of an SBOM, there's a lot that goes into that, right? You're going to be attesting that everything in that SBOM is true. We've heard that attestation word come up in several panels today. The SBOM is no different. You're going to be attesting that the supply chain going into that software component, excuse me, was indeed accurately represented and reported against. And so this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting, right? When we talk about CISA, we talk about things like zero trust. And CISA put out a zero trust maturity model, and there are other guidelines and guidance documents at the federal level around zero trust. Well, guess what? The DoD, we're opinionated. We like to be opinionated. We're good at being opinionated, right? We have impact levels. We don't just have FedRAMP, we have impact levels. We have 4 and 5. Impact levels 4 and 5 gets debated on LinkedIn, at bars, everywhere, every week, whether we should have 2 different impact levels or 1 impact level. But the DoD had an opinion. We put that out there. We have an opinion on zero trust. The DoD has its own zero trust, excuse me, its own zero trust reference architecture. We have a cybersecurity reference architecture, the CSRA, version 2.0 is coming out, right? We have lots of opinions about this stuff. So it stands to reason when we look at SBOMs and the guidance coming out from CISA as a result of that executive order. Does anybody here think that the DoD will have an opinion about SBOMs? I guarantee you, we will have an opinion about SBOMs. Now that opinion is going to take the form of short-term goals, midterm goals, and long-term goals. I knew I shouldn't have had those chips for lunch. I'm regretting that. Those goals are going to manifest themselves in different ways. And what I'm sharing today is just a vision that I have of what SBOM could look like for the department. It's not authoritative in any stretch of the imagination, so don't go right here going, oh, well, I heard this is exactly how it's going to operate. Well, that's not the case, right? But we need to, oh yeah, thanks, I'm good. It literally is just a tickle, and that would just be ugly. Cough drop would. So we have an opinion about bill of materials in general, and we have a number of different things that we need to consider beyond just software. And we need to think about this in the benefits of unifying our view of this ecosystem at the OSD level, at the Office of the Secretary of Defense level. We don't want to be successful with SBOMs only within a given program. That defeats the purpose. We need to be able to answer questions like, across all of the Army, what is our exposure? Across all of our joint assets, what is our exposure to this 0 day? Who's using this library? The ability to blend threat intelligence, potentially classified threat intelligence, even about open source contributors, and understanding where they're affecting libraries with their commits and what that means to the critical infrastructure of the Department of Defense. And so we need to have this visibility not only from a program level, but from a higher level. But it's a two-way street, right? The programs are going to have the ability to actually look at this and understand their supply chain better. But perhaps more importantly, they can actually align with other programs of record. Novel concept, one program talking to another program. Why are you using that library? We aren't using that library, but we're both needing that same sort of software component and that same sort of functionality. Should we be using that library or should you be using ours? Well, let's look into this. Is there threat intelligence against this? Are there risks against this? Is it well maintained? Understanding all of those factors, that consumption of the SBOM is so critical to our programs. And so when you are generating your goods, if there's a software component, that SBOM becomes quite vital to the successful operation of that system to help our warfighters return home. We want to be able to forecast. We saw in the executive order, hey, we need to identify what is considered critical infrastructure. And there was follow-on guidance within the requisite time frame that outlined what constitutes critical infrastructure. There's software in a lot of different places across that critical infrastructure. And so that gives us the ability to look out and not only see what's going on there, but think of this. If we had the ability to look across the totality of the Department of Defense's software ecosystem and ask, what are the top 25 open source software libraries in use today at the Department of Defense? Would that be a compelling nugget of information to have available to you? I would be deeply interested in that. And then if I had that list of the top 25, I could actually go to our intelligence apparatus and say, tell me what you know about this. Tell me about the contributors. Tell me about the companies behind these libraries. Are we at risk in these libraries because they feed into critical systems that we run at the DoD and potentially beyond into DHS? Well, without the SBOMs, I can't answer that question. I don't know. I can't forecast anything, right? That's a problem. I can't synchronize to gain economies of scale. That's often something that the department is heavily criticized for in the media, our ability to create APIs, to create data sets, to make that accessible to our partners in the DIB, as well as to other programs in different military services. We kind of aren't good at that, if I'm being honest with ourselves, right? We need to improve in that area. Well, part of that is understanding the inventory that's available, and what better way to do that than through a standard. The guidance that we could put out, we saw this morning another example from Pete Kim, the number of guidance documents and the level of depth coming out of CISA with the NSA and other logos on there is tremendous. Well, how do we turn that in toward ourselves and look at the software that we run at the Department of Defense and you run in the DIB? If we had SBOMs and they were actually consumed and not just generated, and we could run analytics and do AI and ML against that, we could actually put out more meaningful guidance for the DIB as opposed to a bullhorn. We could actually do a text message that says, hey, you've got this library, you supplied us with this library, we just found a threat on this, so not only are we in trouble, but guess what? You got an issue too, and you should take care of that promptly, right? It's better than the bullhorn effect. And so ultimately, when we look across the software ecosystem, we see the value of the SBOM, but in talking to colleagues at CDAO, which is the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office that was newly stood up, the CDAO is looking at this going, well, we have data sets that we get from you, from the DIB. We have data sets that we purchase to run analytics on, to use, to train our AI models. We kind of want to know the provenance of that data. Is that raw data or is it refined data that you're giving us? We'd like to know that. We also see AI models becoming quite the topic. Digital twins, digital models. Tell us about that. How are you going to describe that digital twin and its capabilities? And so CDAO is looking at this, make no mistake about it. They're not just looking at SBOMs, they're looking at what they're calling DBOMs for data bill of materials, for a data set. They are absolutely positively looking at ABOMs for analytics and any AI ML models, because they need to understand if there are limits or if there is natural bias in that mathematical model. They need to know about that. And they look at the standards that are out there and they go, we also need to know about our operational bill of materials. Because when I have a deployed destroyer over an Indo-PACOM, I may not, by choice, decide to upgrade the software systems on that at this moment in time. And so those destroyers that are in port in Norfolk, they're going to have this version of this software suite. This destroyer over here in the Med is going to have this version of the software suite. And this destroyer over here in Indo-PACOM, whole different number. We kind of need to track that too and be able to understand the ramifications of that. One of the terms that I found interesting at the Department of Defense is POND. Anybody here heard of POND? You don't count, Brian. Period of non-disruption. What that means is you're not applying any updates. Anything that was planned, we've got something important going on, like, oh, I don't know, Russia went into the Ukraine. And so these systems are critical, and there's now a POND notice on them, and you're not going to upgrade that software. That planned rollout for the next version with new capabilities on Saturday, yeah, that's cut. until further notice. So when you get a pond, it doesn't matter whether you were ready to go in an hour or in a week, it's off the books at that point, right? So that operational aspect to be able to understand, well, wait a minute, I'm in a pond, but there's a serious 0 day. Log4Shell, anybody? Saw that in the news? I probably, pond or no pond, want to go fix that pretty quickly. So I need to have that information. I need to have that insight. And so you look across the totality of all these configurations and permutations, and you realize there's a huge need for this inventory and for this understanding to be at a digital level within the Department of Defense. And if we aren't careful, we're going to shove all this down into the lowest level at the PMO level, and we're going to have an individual program manager have to deal with this and find an ATO'd system to go run a registry or a repository, or worse, they're going to take those email attachments and they're going to shove them on a file share that nobody will know about once that individual PCSs to a new billet in 6 months from now. That's not helpful either. We probably don't want it at the PEO level either, because you're going to have different program execution offices in the Air Force from the Navy, and they're not going to be able to collaborate and get those benefits that we talked about. And how does OSD actually look at the trending? How do we create models if we have to go out there all over the place? We could do it at the military service level and try to federate it at that level to a higher level. Or, as part of the software modernization strategy, we've already identified there are key things that the department does that are best suited to be a centralized enterprise service. And perhaps an SBOM repository or a BOM repository could be a great example of something that runs at that enterprise capability level to allow the PMOs, the PEOs, and all the services to have this capability to be able to say, this is where we're going to put this information. So when DCMA keeps track of all those CLINs and goes, oh, yep, I've got your digital bill of materials, it has your data set information, it has your software BOM, it has your analytics models, your digital twin models, all that stuff. We're going to go put that over here, and we'll be able to run analytics on that. That could be quite powerful for the Department of Defense. So that's my vision. There are really two standards out there that are competing. I have my personal favorite, but that's a personal opinion. I'm not going to speak to that today. But SPDX and Cyclone DX, SPDX version 3 at the moment is not backwards compatible, so if you've learned anything about 2.x, forget all that. You have to start over once 3 is formally ratified. They're both open standards. They both have pluses and minuses. Honestly, I'm a little concerned if the DoD is not opinionated and doesn't pick one, because the ability to map between the two is quite challenging, especially when you get to metadata that's going to be unique to a program, and they're going to say, oh, we're going to use a field called foo, and this other program in a different service goes, we shall call that field bar. Well, now somebody's going to have to figure out the mapping between them, and how do I report on that and query against that, and it's a whole mess. So I personally hope that the DoD is opinionated, and we pick one of these open standards going forward. And that's the long-term vision, right? At some point, the DFARS will have to be updated to say, this is what the standard is, this is the data standard the DoD wants, we want it delivered in this way, in this manner, et cetera, and we'll create that obligation. And so, in conclusion, the path forward, I look at education, not only of the DIB and the outreach that we have to do to help you understand why this matters to the DoD. Not just the software bill of materials, but all these other ones is going to be critical. It's going to be a partnership. Like everything that we do, we're going to need your input. We're going to need your advice. We're going to have to think about this from the software factory perspective beyond. We can't just look at it and call it data and hope that it magically appears somewhere. We're going to have to realize we need to integrate this into the custom things that we compile, we rebuild as the government, as the Department of Defense, if we're going to hope to achieve the visibility through consumption. So when you hear about SBOMs, I would implore you to realize you have to understand what your software is doing, what it's running, and if you've got anything that you're delivering to the DoD that has a software component, the value that we can get for the warfighters out of that information is profound if it's accurate and the attestation is there. So with that, I think I have some time left for a few questions, if I'm not mistaken.
All right.
Don't call on him.
I have one question.
Sir.
Sir, wonderful talk. One question. We have a cage code process today. Are you leveraging that, or what are the weaknesses of the cage code process we have today for mechanical and other forms of bombs that we use today?
Yeah, so in terms of the cage code, I don't think it goes to the level of fidelity that the software bill of materials in particular is looking at. And so that's where I see the differentiation is the fidelity to go down and actually talk about transitive dependencies from a software perspective. And what I mean by a transitive dependency is there's a dependency that might exist only at compilation time that you don't actually have to deliver with your product. And so we need to actually understand that dependency and then its dependencies as well in some cases to really understand if something's being injected into that supply chain.
I have a follow-up, and I'll say it loudly. I'll do it loudly. Well, real question is,
We need the mic.
is existing, right, we have the mic. Sorry. We have the cage code, given the weaknesses and probably the archaic, it was developed a long time ago, but it is a structure that we all understand, and it exists in every contracting space.
Mm-hmm.
Adding to it or modifying it, would that not be a consideration? Putting requirements so that to build the requirements to help with the SBOM.
Yeah, so when we, if I go back to this slide here on, if I can get the slides back up, please. When we look at the Cyclone DX, for example, the bill of materials, there's the ability to have metadata information so you can create those bidirectional links within that BOM itself to create those linkages if the department wanted to go that way. But that's a very valid point.
Dr. Herman, you had a question?
Is it your vision that this would be automated flowing out of a DevSecOps pipeline?
Absolutely. I truly believe nobody will be creating an SBOM by hand. This will all be automated through a tool. Most of the tools, the early tools to market today, it's a flag. Do you want to generate SPDX or do you want to generate Cyclone DX? And then it will spit out in the appropriate format the file for you with all of that information. I would truly be blown away if somebody was trying to create an SBOM by hand. I just don't even know if you could physically pull that off. The submission of that ideally would be through an appropriate secured portal, similar to submission of other artifacts related to the contract. So maybe it goes through, was it MOCA's, the DCMA mechanism of MOCA, mechanism of contract administration or something like that. The system that had the best line ever in my tenure at DoD. This system was written before Voyager 2 launched and demonstrates the staying power of COBOL, sir. That was a great line when I heard it.
Right, no, we got right here.
Over here? Yes.
Yeah, I totally understand the power that this could bring in doing analysis for the bill of materials. But once you do that, isn't it a double-edged sword in that if it gets into the wrong hands and there's a zero-day vulnerability, now the adversary also has the deployed assets that they could attack with a 0 day?
Yeah, so in terms of the double-edged sword, I believe that's my personal opinion is that is a faulty argument. When you look at data from the industry, companies like Sneak have showed that upwards of 80 to 85% of software today is open source and it's not secret sauce. The last 15% is where the secret sauce is. The department is no different in terms of its software consumption model. When I look across all of the software factories and what they're building, I can start rattling off libraries that we're using. So our enemies already know we're using Kubernetes. They already know that we're using Docker. They already know that we're using Linkerd or Istio. They know all these frameworks already for 80%. And the secret sauce that's the custom code that the geeky geeks have written, if that's going to be the true secret sauce, that's not going to show up in an SBOM because it's proprietary code that was developed by that company. And so that is still protected, potentially behind CUI. and all the things that we've talked about today. So that, in my mind, when I look at that composition of software and I say 80% is what the Silicon Valley industry experts are saying is comprising most applications today in the commercial market, hiding that information doesn't really accomplish anything. They know we're using Kubernetes. They know we're using Java compilers. They know we're using these tools. In some cases, sadly, better than we know, because we will sap a program. And as somebody pointed out in Project Bravo, who here has the security clearances to understand and look at the data for F-22, F-35, F-16, and the Aegis destroyer? Like those tickets, nobody has those tickets, and yet all those programs are sapped. And so our enemies are probably aggregating more data and doing more with that data than what we are doing internally with the DoD because of our siloed process and the way we sap things.
We have 10 more minutes.
Oh, alrighty then.
Slight tangent from the SBOMs is, I know that some industries will actually take the SBOM and then they will have a demarcation where they will incorporate the open source libraries into kind of an enclave that they are on some periodic basis vetting, and their production software is only built from that vetted source. They're still benefiting from the open source, and you get the rapid iteration in their testing and development. But then when they go through their production proofing cycle, they actually do a deeper dive into the commits, into the code in order to filter that out. Does your vision include some sort of that sort of interface where we have a kind of a vetted source, and if you were to pull from there, you know that there's a better chance that has not had something injected?
Yeah, so what we see taking place today in the department is also taking place in commercial industry. The movement to this thing called a software container. And a software container is this pre-built artifact that does one thing and one thing well. For example, you could have a software container that's a web server, and it knows how to be a web server, and it's pre-configured with only those libraries that it needs. Within the Air Force, we have something called Iron Bank, and Iron Bank is a software container registry. And within the Army, we have a different registry. Sometimes they will not share because, in my personal opinion, we get lost in semantics. Our authorizing officials don't want to trust other authorizing officials. We talk about reciprocity, and I like to talk about reciprocity as an evil word without further clarification. Do you want opaque reciprocity between these libraries or transparent reciprocity? Opaque is, hey, I did my job, trust me, just take the software and run it. It'll be okay. Transparent reciprocity is, here's my body of evidence. These are all the things that I've looked at. This is how the team analyzed it. If you need to build on that, great, build on that, but don't redo the work. I aspire for transparent reciprocity, and when I look at software containers as that building block, I help spearhead the creation of the Container Governance Task Force that is a cross-functional team co-chaired by the Army and the Air Force SMEs to go figure out for a DoD-wide what is the recommendation for the way we are going to evaluate commercial technology insertion via software containers so that we are all speaking the same language, and we might actually take a step forward to transparent reciprocity between AOs that will trust each other because they're looking at that evidence and everybody collected the same evidence. So I think in terms of directly answering your question, I would hope that we get to the point where we don't have to say it has to be in a silo, and if it's not here, then we don't want to use it, because I think that's dangerous when you look at how fast software moves. What I would hope is that we instead embrace this idea of consistently evaluating the cybersecurity posture of the software container and having transparent reciprocity between the different programs such that their AOs won't say, well, we got to start over from scratch and it'll be 6 to 9 months before we can let you run that on our system. Does that address your question, sir?
Okay, we have a question from the virtual audience.
Okay. I will virtually answer.
So this is more of a ask for thoughts and comments about when contracting with DoD or AF cyber organizations to pitch cutting-edge solutions, many of the organizations don't seem interested in acquiring small business cyber solutions. They seem to prefer to develop internally or to work with primes instead. What can the small business do to bring their cutting-edge technology, and how can the SBOM kind of fit into that?
So that is a tough question. I think the first caveat I should say is I sit in DoD CIO. We, by statute, don't have acquisition authority. We don't buy systems. We don't buy stuff. And so to that end, our lawyers won't even allow us to write a letter of support for a cyber phase 2. Multiple folks reach out to me. I had somebody reach out today asking for a letter of support, and our lawyers said, no, we're DoD CIO. We don't do that. What we like to look at is our mission partners like DISA. There's a lot of cyber stuff going on there, and it could just be simply that the small firms are pitching to the wrong programs or pitching to the wrong people. But there's certainly other avenues within the DoD. We have a huge appetite for this. We absolutely are interested in that. I would
I'm going to interrupt
let Brian.
Dr. Herman give
yeah.
you some.
So
for it.
I'll jump in just for a second, because I'm also a program
Phone a
executive
friend.
officer, so we do have,
Would you mind?
certainly, sir. So we do have acquisition authority. One of the things that I look for with small companies is I want you to be the innovative technical leaders in the capabilities that you're proposing. I don't want you to be a front for a large. That might get you in the door, but in the end, what that means is that I'm paying 50% of the money for something that's not adding a lot of value for the contract. So I really want you to be the prime in the case where you are the technical leader. And we have all kinds of contracting strategies that can get you there.